themselves. Australasia is the most isolated and distinctive region on Earth. At its heart is the world's largest island, Australia. A continent born out of barren Earth, worn down by wind and water, for an infinity before man. But since the time humans arrived, a new element has shaped this land. Fire has been the destroyer and the creator of life here, in a cycle that goes on to this day. This region, more than any other, has been transformed by humans. By the first arrivals, the Aborigines of Australia. By the Maori of New Zealand, who came from Polynesia in great ocean-going canoes. And by the people who followed in the wake of Captain Cook, the latest to set foot on these shores. The third and final wave of the people I call the future eaters. The thing that sets us apart from the people of the old world is that we're all invaders. We're colonisers from 3 great waves of human invasion into this region. And I think us Australasians share something else in common. We're all future eaters. For together we've so upset the balance of life here that we threaten the very lands that support us. And through that, our own survival. Our story begins here in Australia, a vast stage upon which life has led its own distinctive evolutionary dance. This land is dominated by creatures that have survived nowhere else on the planet. We all recognise these improbable animals today, but what made them so different? And how was our natural history changed when humans first arrived here? I'm setting out on a journey across this country. But what I really want to do is to travel back in time. And that's because the story I'm going to tell you happened so long ago that it's difficult to find evidence to support it. But all over this country, in its plants and its animals and its rocks, you find clues as to the way things were. And from that we can start to tell about the forces that shaped this country, the things that made Australia what it is today. All the lands of Australasia have developed from the earliest times as worlds apart. 90 million years ago, the ancient continent of Gondwana began to fragment. Tasmantis broke off first to form New Zealand and New Caledonia. Then Meganesia floating on a massive continental crust, formed New Guinea, Tasmania, and the great continent of Australia. In an evolutionary sense, Australia is a unique experiment. On every other continent, the placental mammals, big energy users like lions, elephants, and even humans, have won the evolutionary race. But here, in a race for extreme energy efficiency, these creatures, marsupials like the kangaroos, have evolved to a position of preeminence. The largest marsupial in the world is the red kangaroo. No other animal is big hops, but hopping allows the kangaroo to recapture the energy of each bound in the tendons of its legs. The force of each leap pushes its gut back, drawing air into its lungs and saving it from using its chest muscles to breathe. Hopping has made the kangaroo one of the most energy-efficient travellers on the planet. The special conditions that drove this quest for energy efficiency are most apparent here, in the so-called dead heart of the continent. This land has such old and poor soil that if you're not efficient, you don't survive. If you want to understand the history of this continent, there's no better place to come than here, Uluru. The timeless rounded features of the rock show that it just hasn't been disturbed for hundreds of millions of years. There's been no volcanoes, no mountain building, no ice age here to rejuvenate this place. And as a result, the soil here is old, leached and exhausted. All that's left really is just sand. The roots of Australia's infertility lie in its thick crust. It hasn't crumpled to form mountains or been punctured by volcanoes. Most importantly, the Ice Age was unkind to Australia. There were no glaciers to grind the rocks and release the elements that life depends on. Instead, the land lay comatose. Its nutrients have been slowly leaching and blowing away for eons. It's one of nature's great paradoxes that the poorest ground supports the greatest biodiversity. The infertile soils of Western Australia give life to over 10,000 species. In this heathland known as Kwongan, there aren't enough resources for these plants to overwhelm each other, so they're forced to coexist. These soils are so poor that strongly competitive species just haven't been able to dominate. Instead, we've got this fantastic biodiversity, and a most peculiar biodiversity it is too. These plants are so adapted to the infertility of the place that the common garden fertiliser you throw into your garden to make it grow will actually kill them. The plants of the heathland have had to develop intimate relationships with insects and other animals for their survival. The scarlet banksia lures the tiny honey possum with its abundant nectar. This marsupial is the only mammal to depend entirely on flowers for its food. And as it feeds, it pollinates the plants of the heathland. But how can such a rich ecosystem have grown out of such adversity?
The colossal levels of biodiversity that characterize the Australian heath, some of the what looks to be most inhospitable, infertile type country, has to do with this unique Australian response to these environments. The soils were very nutrient poor, but that enabled little pockets of animals and plants to start to develop as unique things in 100,000 different places.
Here, nature has been turned on its head. Plants have even become predators, like the pitcher plant, which lures insects into its specially evolved trap, where they become consumed in the plant's own juices. Even more extraordinary are the sundews. They've evolved movement to actively capture their prey and extract the minerals that the soil is unable to yield. Australia's plants and animals have been so successful in dealing with the infertility of this continent that often they've created what amounts to a grand illusion. And nowhere is that more apparent than here in the rainforest. In northern Queensland, the rich tropical forests are home to Australia's greatest biodiversity. The tree kangaroos have only recently left their ground-dwelling relatives. Now they forage in the safety of the rainforest canopy. The bizarre mating dance of the riflebird is just one of the many extravagant displays of life in this living Eden. On the forest floor, the brush turkey builds its mound. It's one of the few birds that uses heat generated by the decomposing litter to incubate its eggs. The same rotting leaf litter releases the essentials for life so rapidly that nothing has the chance to escape. It makes the rainforest one of the most efficient recycling systems ever evolved. But elsewhere, the quest for efficiency has had quite a different outcome. They say that the eyes are the windows to the soul, but really, they lead straight to the brain. And the brain of the koala tells a story of evolutionary woe that you just wouldn't believe. In the eucalypt forest, a koala and her young cub search for the tender new growth that make up their entire diet. But eucalypt leaves are so full of dangerous chemicals and so low in nutrients that the koala has evolved to be one of the greatest energy misers of all time. It moves slowly and has a low reproductive rate, but it's made one even greater sacrifice. Marsupials are notorious for having tiny brains, but the koala's really gone out on a limb because it's the only mammal on Earth whose brain doesn't fit its skull. 40% of the space inside there is just fluid. And that's because the brain is a real extravagance. It takes more energy to run than any other organ in the body. And the koala has traded brain power for survival. Wombats too have evolved a unique but less drastic strategy to conserve their energy. Australia's 3 species of wombat are the only large herbivores in the world that live in burrows. By spending long periods underground, they require only a third as much food as a similar-sized kangaroo. It's long been believed that the marsupials are primitive relics, surviving in Australia only because of its isolation. But on the contrary, now we're seeing just how well they've adapted to Australia's demanding conditions.
It's entirely possible that marsupials are better adapted to the kind of strenuous demands that Australia has placed on mammals of any kind than placental mammals might have been. They certainly have an extremely wide, what's called metabolic scope. They're very responsive to changes in the climate, to temperature. They're much more tolerant of environmentally stressful conditions. Placentals are fussier about what they need to survive. That may have given marsupials an edge.
Marsupials were so successful that before humans arrived, Australia was a land of giants. Of all the marsupial megafauna, the largest was Diprotodon. Weighing over a tonne, it was another energy conserver with a tiny brain.
I think we've got the breathing working pretty smoothly. Happy with that?
Yeah, I'm actually quite happy with the jaw movement. I think that's looking really good.
Diprotodon was just one of 60 species of megafauna that once roamed the land.
Yeah, always trying for that magic moment.
Giant flightless birds, horned turtles, and at least 20 kinds of kangaroo. At Flinders University in Adelaide, they're being brought back to life.
The interesting thing about the megafauna is that, of course, they're all leaf eaters or browsers. And that way of life is the way of life of a junk food eater. These animals eat the rubbish plants, and as a result of that, they have to be large. If you have long legs, you have long stride. An animal the size of Diprotodon, for instance, would probably move at about 8 to 9 kilometres per hour.
The giant short-faced kangaroo was unlike any living species. Indeed, in some ways, it had evolved to resemble humans.
It's very tall when it's standing up. It's higher than a man, with a short face, with a bifocal vision, massively thick set, and performing an action that's unique to these animals, I believe, is that they can raise their arms above their shoulders, and that's how they used to grasp vegetation and pull it down to eat. And so if you have a thing like this, stooped, muscular, working through the trees and the bushes in the early morning, well, you might well imagine it's a man-beast.
The megafauna thrived in Australia for millions of years. In fact, they were here till just 60,000 years ago. It might seem like a far-off and exotic time when giant creatures like these walked the landscape. But really, all of the native animals that you can see in Australia today were already in existence by then. You could have heard the same kookaburras in the trees and seen the same lizards and snakes on the ground. But on top of all of that was this magnificent megafauna, as diverse and spectacular as Africa's today. And the big question really is, what happened to these creatures? Well, I think they might have gone on if it hadn't been for a new species developing in far-off Africa. And that species was us. Our ancestors began their long journey out of Africa over 100,000 years ago. They were the product of a different evolutionary race, a tooth and claw fight with the fiercest predators on the planet. Travelling eastwards, they eventually reached Southeast Asia, an island realm rich in coastal resources, where they lived from the bounty of the sea. The need to harvest marine life, like turtle eggs from offshore islands, would have been the incentive that drove them to develop the world's first watercraft, an invention essential to the next stage of their migration. In what is now eastern Indonesia, they reached the edge of the world they knew. There, a water barrier, almost 100 kilometres of open sea, stood before them. No one can be certain when humans first crossed that water barrier, the sea that isolated Meganesia from the rest of the world. The best estimate is between 40 and 60,000 years ago, a time when Australia and New Guinea were still joined. The first humans to enter what is now New Guinea would have been astonished by the fauna. They'd never have seen huge flightless birds like the cassowary before, nor marsupials like the cuscus. At first they lived by hunting and gathering in the dense rainforest. As these Aboriginal migrants moved into the highlands of New Guinea, they found rich volcanic soils. Here, they settled for the first time. They became some of the world's earliest farmers, domesticating and cultivating plants from the forest, and giving the world key food crops like taro and sugarcane. This new, settled way of life allowed them to develop sophisticated societies whose culture has some of the most spectacular of all human rituals. Warriors in the cassowary dance show their strength and endurance by carrying the great birds on their shoulders. Living in balance with nature, their traditional way of life survives even today. Rising sea levels divided New Guinea from Australia just 10,000 years ago. But long before then, perhaps as much as 60,000 years ago, people had already moved south. These first Australians would have encountered some of the most fearsome cold-blooded carnivores since the age of the dinosaurs. The largest reptile of all was a relative of the lace monitor, the 7-metre-long megalania. For millions of years, the megafauna had survived with these giant predators, but they had no defences against man. To Australia's megafauna, this was a deadly weapon. And that's because these huge creatures were built for supreme energy efficiency. They were slow-moving, and despite their enormous heads, they had tiny brains. But worst of all, they'd evolved for millions of years in an ecosystem where nothing like humans had ever existed. And that made them naive. They had no fear of human hunters. The new arrivals had evolved in competition with the great predators of the African savannah. But it was only when they entered Meganesia that their language and stone tools gave them a decisive advantage. They'd left behind their predators and diseases and were about to become all-powerful beings in a virgin land. As they moved south beyond the Arnhem Land Plateau, they found game-rich forests and grasslands, ideal for hunting the vast herds of megafauna. Australia's open landscape would have enabled people to spread quickly across the continent, following trails that linked watering and feeding sites for the megafauna. The ancestors of the Aborigines had stumbled across what appeared to be a land of plenty. The prey they feasted on was large and tame and easily hunted. I think it's possible that these people could have unleashed a wave of extinctions across the entire continent.
Throughout the world in the Pleistocene we've seen extinction of these large animals, and that extinction's always been correlated with the spread of human beings across the surface of the globe. And of course the immediate inference is that humans are the agent responsible for their extinction. But it's also a period that correlates, of course, with major climatic change associated with global glaciation. And so you've got two confounding variables there.
Was it climate change that killed off Australia's megafauna? Or was it man? It's probably the hottest issue in Australia's prehistory. Until recently, it was thought the megafauna died out around 20,000 years ago, the height of the last ice age. But now some intriguing evidence has turned up out here in the centre of the continent. Today, Lake Eyre is a salt lake, hostile to just about all life. It's so hot out here that the tiny Lake Eyre dragon walks on its heels to avoid burning its toes. It feeds on the ants that harvest insects blown onto the baking salt crust. But life here hasn't always been so hard. The lake was once permanently full and teeming with life, a favoured breeding ground for the giant flightless bird Genyornis. About twice as heavy as today's emu, its axe-like beak suggested it could eat tough vegetation. It was a member of the megafauna that lived along the once lush shores of Lake Eyre. Remnants of life from that time have accumulated here for the last 200,000 years. From these bands of sediment, we can tell what lived here and when they died. These cliffs preserve a record of great climate change. The rocks here were laid down at a time when this lake was full and was teeming with life. There's even remains of megafauna here, mostly eggshells of the great extinct bird Genyornis. But the interesting part of that story is up over here. If Genyornis died out because of climate change in the last ice age, then their eggshells would be here in the top layers of sediment laid down 20,000 years ago. But the shell is only found in the older, lower layers, going back to a time when the climate was mild. It suggests that Genyornis became extinct much earlier, at the same time that I think humans arrived. This is a piece of an eggshell laid by one of the last Genyornis ever to live in this area. It's 60,000 years old, which is about 40,000 years before the great climatic crisis of the last ice age, which was previously thought to cause the extinction of the megafauna. It suggests that it was something earlier which caused the extinction of these great animals. Was it the arrival of humans? My guess is that it was, and that it occurred throughout this continent, long before climate change could have ever had an effect on these animals. This is the first hard evidence that the arrival of humans, rather than climate, played the decisive role in megafaunal extinction. but it was just the beginning of a cascade of changes that would reverberate through Australia's ecosystems. The extinction of the megafauna destroyed a balance between plants and animals that had evolved over millions of years. Now, countless tonnes of uneaten food covered the land. As the last of the Diprotodons were dying, these vast plains and woodlands and rainforests were empty. But the vegetation those animals ate was still growing, here, building up, just waiting for that spark that had set the continent ablaze. This place has always been struck by lightning, but now it ignited huge fires, fuelled by the built-up vegetation. Fire had always been here in small areas like the heathlands, but now great walls of flame swept across the land, threatening the survival of the smaller animals. A devastating new force had been unleashed. It's hard to know what happened next, but there's evidence in the landscape that the nature of the country was dramatically changed by fire. This is just one tiny remnant of the fire-sensitive forests that once covered vast areas of the continent's north and east. It's places like these that I think offer us some clues as to the way Australia has changed in the past. Here, a hot fire has eaten deep into a rainforest and eucalypts are taking over. Well, that's the kind of pattern I think happened again and again over northern and eastern Australia when fire was first let loose on this continent. Rainforests are killed by fire, but the eucalypts had evolved in the fire-prone areas and they thrived on it. In an unholy alliance with fire, the eucalypts spread across the continent, destroying the original forests, creating the Australian landscape we know today. I think the triumph of the eucalypts was to change even the climate of the continent. The original forests had acted like a sponge, storing huge quantities of moisture and transpiring it back into the atmosphere. This allowed the monsoon rains to penetrate hundreds of kilometres south. The rains fed a permanent river system that flowed inland, filling the lakes at the heart of the continent. They were a haven for great hosts of birds. Pelicans, cormorants, stilts, all came here to breed in their millions. It was clearly a different environment from what you see today. John McGee has been studying the climate record here dating back to the time when Lake Eyre was permanently full.
The lake is a bit like a rain gauge for the continent. It represents moisture that's coming into the continent from the monsoon, and early in this phase of sediments that we see in this cliff, which start back at 120,000 years ago, we see a very full lake, and a lake that was obviously supporting a lot of wildlife. The rivers must have been perennially flowing from Queensland into here.
But how did Australia's great inland sea become a dry salt lake?
One possible explanation is that changes in the vegetation in the catchments up in the monsoon area has prevented effective penetration of the moisture from the monsoon into those catchments.
The newly established eucalypt forests couldn't retain water. Rain was no longer carried inland. The rivers stopped flowing. The arrival of humans had sent the land spiralling out of control. Firestorms ravaged the country. Plants, animals and resources were being destroyed, and people faced dramatic climate change. It was a world that should be familiar to modern Australians. The story of how the first future eaters recovered from this disaster is one of humanity's greatest triumphs. About 20 kilometres up this road here is Owenpelly in Arnhem Land. And that's the place where Aboriginal culture has survived least influenced over the last 200 years. And there we can get some real insights into how people have lived in this continent for tens of thousands of years before Europeans ever arrived here. In time, the way Aboriginal people learned to live with the land would give rise to an entirely new and radically different human culture. The Aborigines who live at Owenpelly believe their ancestors arrived here from the north, carried across the seas by Ingana, the creation mother. Wow, that's amazing. Isn't that fantastic? I've never seen anything like that before.
This is that main art gallery here now, last time.
Aboriginal rock art and religion are among the oldest on the planet. But this is stunning. There must be hundreds and hundreds of images on that, eh? And that's the kangaroo collar bar, yeah?
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah. Barramundi.
Yeah, Barramundi.
The rock paintings of Arnhem Land depict a great human endeavour that goes back beyond recorded time. This is the most amazing, delicate rock art I've ever seen. Beautiful red ochre on a white quartzite base. It's just extraordinarily complex and it's full of meaning, but I just lack the key at the moment to understand what it's trying to say to me. It's a record of life here, I guess, for who knows how many thousands of years. Their art has survived, but the story of how these people learned to live with this land has been largely lost. They must have faced a crucial challenge. Their very existence was threatened. Taming the fire was the first step towards creating a new balance. When Aborigines first picked up the fire stick, they held a powerful tool. I think they learnt to fight fire with fire and began to burn off the built-up vegetation, reducing the fuel load that was feeding the raging wildfires. Eventually, this developed into a highly sophisticated system of fire stick farming, still practiced in parts of northern and central Australia. Knowledge of how to manage the land through burning has been passed on by countless generations of tribal elders. The bush was burned into a patchwork of old and new growth. It made an ideal habitat for the remaining smaller animals. They actually flourished under this regime of fire stick farming and could now be hunted sustainably. For the Aborigines, burning was remarkably like farming because it brought new growth, food for the animals they hunted.
Palu nyorka dengan nyoke yang palu mai nyarong kawan gara bakal mai kampur arba cukwere nyereng pa korko oan kara mai ngana ba maroko anang bojo.
These people harvested the fruit and grain-producing plants that grew in the wake of their burning. The big question is why they never took the next step and cultivated them. But this continent was different. On top of the problem of poor soils, there was drought. Long before the arrival of man, Australia was already at the mercy of El Niño, an erratic cycle of drought and flood. The problem all Australia's inhabitants face is never knowing when the next drought will strike. They've got to be prepared to make the best of the good times. Female kangaroos are constantly pregnant or have a young one in the pouch. That way, the young kangaroo has a head start when the drought breaks. Rock wallabies can take advantage of the briefest showers. They can even carry water in their mouths to their young, waiting safely above. The most widespread adaptation is nomadism, and the banded stilt is possibly the most extraordinary nomad in the world. They can wait on the coast for up to a decade for the drought to break. Then, within days of rain filling the inland lakes, they fly thousands of kilometres to begin their breeding cycle. In just 7 weeks, these remarkable birds can produce 2 clutches of eggs. Their hatchlings feed on the rich, briny soup which fills the lakes. After just 3 weeks, they're ready to fly. Life on this continent has always depended on movement from place to place to live with the cycle of drought and flood. The Aborigines found that they could be no different. The vagaries of Australia's climate kept them on the move. They simply couldn't settle down like people elsewhere to cultivate their land. Instead, they moved across the land, following what were to them highways, linking resources from one place to another.
Muranyangan kurung kalanya na pai, kapai jodoh jangan carlo jodoh kalanya jangan kalanya na pai. Jangan kurung kalanya na pai, ma bija pai, la nyara kurulan ko pai, ngora ko jubur, menula bija menula ngora jangan kalunya na, jangan kalanya jodoh kalanya na pai. No pian pa.
The laws governing these journeys are still passed down from one generation to the next in song. They sing the paths the Aboriginal people followed as they travelled across their country. They're a guide to food, water and safe passage. The knowledge recorded in song helped the widely spread plans to come together. Sometimes their journeys spanned the continent. These highways became known to Europeans as songlines. To Aboriginal people, they're a map, survival guide and title deed rolled into one. This ceremony represents just one small link in a great chain of human relationships that link people in time and place right across Australia. It essentially turned this continent into a living network of societies. And in an age before modern transport and communication, that has to represent one of humanity's greatest achievements. After having changed everything, these people had set a new pattern for living with the special conditions of Australia. They'd established a remarkable ecological stability. There's little evidence of extinctions in the land for tens of thousands of years. But it was a delicate balance. About 3,500 years ago, the first domesticated animal reached Australia and New Guinea, the dingo. In Asia, the dingo had already become man's best friend. This predator's exquisite sense of smell and ability to track became a gift to Aboriginal hunters. Together, man and dingo made a devastatingly efficient hunting team. But they were hunting the same prey as the last of the large carnivorous marsupials. The Tasmanian devil was once widespread across the continent. It was essentially a scavenger, but soon after the arrival of the dingo, Both it and the dog-like thylacine disappeared from mainland Australia. They were simply outcompeted by humans with pack-hunting dingoes. It could have been the beginning of another wave of extinctions. Animals of the rainforest, like tree kangaroos, were particularly vulnerable. I think they survived because people created sacred sites, which they called story places. They were sanctuaries where no humans could enter, places where fire and hunting were taboo, areas where animals were protected. Most people don't realise how preoccupied the Aborigines were with the sustainable use of their resources. Story places were often conservation reserves, and they included the prime breeding habitat of many species. As the animals built up inside the reserves, they'd move outside where they could be sustainably hunted. They were a really ingenious solution to the extreme conservation difficulties that people face in a place like Australia. Story places are just one aspect of a complex culture that created a new balance in this land. Great meetings of the clans, called corroborees by some tribes, allowed access to trade and marriage partners from outside the clan. But most importantly, they created a network of kinship bonds across the continent, guaranteeing their freedom to move through the country. But always they managed their land. And that was the key, not just to their survival, but to the survival of the land itself. When I was a child, I was told that this was a wild place. I was taught that it was an empty land, a terra nullius. But really, this is a human artefact. For in a very real sense, Aboriginal people created this environment. And they developed a way of living here which endured the test of time for 40,000 years. When my people arrived here, they threw that lesson away. And today we're struggling with the same problems of fire, species extinction and climate change that the Aboriginal people triumphed over 40,000 years ago. The Aborigines were the first people to so alter their environment that they threatened their own existence. The first of the future eaters. But they went through the complete cycle of future eating and eventually developed a highly sophisticated response to this most fragile of continents. In the end, they created an entirely new ecology, one that depended on them for its very survival. For they were the people who tamed the fire.
You can hear Dr. Tim Flannery discuss his ideas and answer his critics tomorrow night with Philip Adams on Late Night Live on Radio National at 10 o'clock. The book of the series is available at ABC shops. Stay with us now for the news following Consuming Passions.